Hello and welcome to Comms Life by APCO Worldwide. I'm your host, Tom Billinghurst. Every week we take a deep dive into the topics and trends shaping the communications industry and beyond. If you had managed to sleep in for the first half of 2020, the world you'd be waking up to today might make you want to go back to bed. We've been hit with a double whammy of unprecedented proportions. An already looming global economic recession has been compounded and exacerbated by our great invisible nemesis, the coronavirus pandemic. With unemployment skyrocketing, mounting public debt, and our mental well-being at an all-time low, we're face to face with potentially the greatest depression since the 1930s. The picture being painted by 2020 is bleak. So, how do we begin an economic recovery with COVID cases still on the rise? And do we need what has been dubbed by the World Economic Forum as the Great Reset, a fundamental reassessment of the economic models that got us here in the first place? Joining us to discuss these questions and more is Rob Willock, Director of the Economist Corporate Network for the Middle East and North Africa region. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Thomas. Great to be with you.
So, Rob, let's not sugarcoat it. It's pretty bad out there, isn't it?
It's not great. You're right. In fact, our forecasts have been steadily inching downwards over the past few months. We weren't really expecting great things from 2020 in the first place, but it's steadily got worse as the full extent of COVID-19 has become apparent.
So by all indications, we were headed towards a downturn or a recession, the dreaded R word anyway. But how badly has COVID-19 accelerated what was expected?
Yeah, well, we didn't actually have 2020 forecast for recession. We had it as a slow and perhaps uninteresting year. The signs weren't good. So the signs pre-COVID were that we were going to have a pretty rough ride in 2020 anyway. Growth, GDP growth globally, we had in the low 2%, but there were a lot of headwinds and there were a lot of downside risks to those, to even those relatively low expectations. So the US-China trade war, for example, was looming large, and that, up until the new year, was the greatest risk we saw to the global economy. We were expecting a drag on global economy from all of those factors. Weaknesses in the US and Chinese domestic economies, turbulence in some emerging markets, Argentina, Brazil, Turkey, and Europe's growth engine slowing. So global growth of about 2.3% we were expecting at the turn of the year. MENA, 2.3%. Nothing special, but very similar to what we'd seen in 2019. And at least positive in every territory, if not every country of the world. But now it's a sea of red, with very few exceptions. We've got the global economy at minus 4.2%, the MENA region at minus 4.1%. And if you think that we are still, by some definitions, an emerging market, that figure should be in opposite positive territory. We should be growing at 4% plus. US at minus 4%, and China, really the only significant economy, ironically, that's going to be in growth this year. China could yet come out of this with some economic competitive advantage.
So all of those factors taken into consideration, one of the Economist's front covers recently had the New World Disorder as its headline, which, like all things Economist, is a fabulous play on words, but it feels like that's what we're headed for. So what in this New World Disorder needs to be done to stage some sort of comeback or economic recovery?
Yeah, well, we need improved business and consumer sentiment. We need people to be back out, active, spending, and I think that's going to take some time. Another Economist cover of recent weeks was one that coined the phrase the 90% economy. And I think that's probably what we can expect as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, if indeed we do come out of the COVID-19 pandemic cleanly. And what we mean by that, what we mean by the 90% economy, is that we are going to see some level of recovery. Of course, pandemic recoveries usually come quite quickly. There's a lot of pent-up demand during the downturn, and then that's released. But we think that this pandemic will be different, not least because there is no obvious solution yet. There's no vaccine yet, and we're still waiting for treatments to be confirmed by the various health authorities. So people will be cautious. People will come out slowly. People won't necessarily return to the pre-COVID-19 levels of activity in terms of travel, in terms of spending on big ticket items. Second half of this year will definitely be better than the first half of this year for those countries that have already gone over the peak of infections. But everyone will be concerned about that dreaded second wave. And so a lot of public policy work will need to be done to both reassure people that we won't get that second peak, and of course to make sure it doesn't come.
So I think this is the balancing act at the moment, and we've heard much talk of the so-called trade-off between rejuvenating economies and safeguarding public health. Say there is a second wave. We've seen signs of it already. Are we better prepared to deal with a second wave now? And further to that, what kind of impact could opening up too soon? We've seen airlines and countries saying that tourists will be welcomed back in a matter of days, and things look like they want to get back to normal as soon as possible. But that's got to be dangerous, right?
Yeah, politicians have a very difficult line to tread at the moment. You know, they are on one hand being guided by scientific advice, which is cautious, of course. And on the other hand, they are being lobbied hard by various industries to allow them to reopen. Because the longer that the shutdowns and the social distancing requirements continue, the longer it's going to take for the various industries affected by them to recover, if indeed they will. And we will see business failures if it goes on for too long. So will we be better equipped for a second wave? Yes, we will. That's partly because we have better knowledge now in terms of what works, how to reduce the spread of the infection. But governments will continue to be cautious. No government got into trouble by being overcautious, but governments will get into trouble if they are seen as reckless in their return to this new normal. The other thing, of course, is affordability. Can countries that have got themselves into huge levels of debt because of the high levels of fiscal stimulus that they're having to deploy, could they afford to do that again? And that's doubtful for many economies. Not everybody can afford to do that. Many countries already have or had high levels of public debt before COVID. Debt has piled onto debt. Cost of borrowing have increased in some places. And we did some work looking at the readiness of some of the emerging markets to be able to deploy the fiscal stimulus packages, the support they need to give to businesses and individuals who are facing joblessness. And I'm afraid that many countries in this region simply could not afford to lock down again to the same level of intensity that they did the first time round. I think that practicality will take over if there's a second wave. Actions will be more targeted. They might be more regionally focused. They might be more sector focused. But I think economies are going to have to release the brakes. They're going to have to let people back out. And the appetite is certainly there. You've seen pictures all around the world of people as soon as the first inch is given, taking a mile. And that will worry policymakers, but at the same time, it will also reinvigorate the economy. So that's the dangerous trade-off that they're really having to play with at the moment. I think the other issue regards to this trade-off is really important, and it's the fact that nobody has yet really explicitly talked about the value of a life. There are industries that have to do that. If you think about sort of actuarial industries that have to put a value on life in order to cost policies. Healthcare industries often have to put a value on life because they balance the cost of drugs against the value of a quality-adjusted measure of life, quality-adjusted for things like age and health. So it's calculated in lots of settings, but it hasn't yet really been talked about during the pandemic. And I think that's because politicians are squeamish. They're squeamish to do so because if you've got elderly or relatives with underlying health conditions, frankly, hearing a politician say, well, we we can't go into lockdown again because of the cost to the economy. We're going to have to let some of the more vulnerable members of our society deal with that higher risk. That's a really hard message for governments to communicate. But then on the other side of that, what is the cost and what is the damage of long-term lockdown? What is the cost of unemployment? What is the cost of the mental health issues that we're going to see as a result of this long period of time in which people haven't had their freedom and have been cooped up? And one of the other things that hasn't really been discussed is what we call the identifiable victim problem. And that views direct victims as more important than indirect victims, certainly from a political point of view. So the direct victims in this instance are obvious. They are all the people that we see represented by the numbers of fatalities every day. These are direct victims of COVID-19. But what we haven't seemed to quantify yet is the cost to the indirect victims, the cost of unemployment, the cost of reduced incomes, the cost of poor mental health. And I think at some stage, people are going to need to quantify that to make a more informed choice around the trade-off that you talk about between healthcare and economy.
All of which makes for a very unenviable position that policymakers and decision makers are in. It's a rock and a hard place with absolutely no blueprint. It's sort of, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, and it could go either way. You mentioned there, Rob, sector by sector approach, should there be a second wave. So I was wondering what industries have been the worst affected from COVID-19 and how they have been looking to recover.
Sadly, I think for the UAE, UAE has been widely praised as one of the few countries in this region that have managed to diversify away from an over-reliance on oil. Mm-hmm. More than 70% of the economy is now non-oil based. But sadly for the UAE, almost all of the sectors into which it has diversified have also been hit by the COVID-19 crisis. So transport and logistics, tourism and hospitality. Plainly, hotels and restaurants have been the worst affected. That was the immediate effect of shutdown. Events and conferences, for those of us involved in the publishing industry. There have been some good news stories. Of course, the grocery industry has had a pretty good time. I mean, from those early days when we saw hoarding and stockpiling. Their challenge then was actually one of ensuring that people could get the products that they need. But ever since then, as they've managed to ensure that their supply chains can keep up, they've done very well. And they've done very well because they are taking up the slack that the restaurant industry can no longer provide. So anything that you do at home, including cooking, is booming. DIY, musical instruments. We were amused to learn that ukulele sales have gone through the roof during COVID lockdown, and other musical instruments, as well as people have had to work out how to entertain themselves at home. Bread makers, another extraordinarily successful category that's really boomed during COVID. Streaming media services and digital subscriptions, of course, have done very well.
If we were to ground this in our industry now, in communications industry, and put you in the hot seat and say, okay, you're going to be in charge of the messaging for your CEO, or you're going to be in charge of the messaging that goes out from your company. What are you advising them to say? Are you advising them to be cautiously optimistic? Are you advising them to avoid certain phrases like a return to normal? Avoid words like opportunity, chance? How do you tread this line and get your company breeding confidence into its consumers and its stakeholders?
I don't think I could advise people not to use a phrase like return to normal. Look, people have to be careful with language. And whilst I think it is important that business leaders and government leaders exude confidence, optimism, gratitude, and these are all things I think that we're hearing frequently from those senior leaders, I think it's important that people advocate for for business environments that will be conducive to a quick recovery. I think governments will be listening out for clues as to what they can do to get their economies back on track, and the private sector will be a very important part of that. So, if as a business leader you think that there are certain things that could be done to reopen your business and your markets and your customers safely and quickly, then I think you need to push for that. And I think you need to find a coalition of organisations to agree with you on those recommendations. So this is new for all of us, as you've said before. We're in unprecedented and uncharted territories here. So make those cases strongly. Highlight the importance of employment and the well-being of your staff. That's going to be a big second-order consequence of COVID-19. I think the impact on people, and in particular employees who have been stuck at home, some of them on furlough, some of them unpaid, some of them on reduced payments, but many of them still expected to do a hard day's work, and many people finding that work-life balance much harder in the home office environment. So I think that a lot of attention needs to be paid to that around the messaging. And of course, the gratitude that we all feel for the key workers. It's really important, I think, for us all to recognise that. And whether those be key workers in the medical space, in sanitation and cleaning, all those people that were probably undervalued for many years and probably underpaid. It'd be really interesting to see whether there's an appetite from both the public and from industry and from governments to help level these people up and make sure that they are properly compensated and properly appreciated.
And what we alluded to in the introduction is this idea of a great reset, of fundamentally reevaluating economies that have been predicated on unmitigated growth at all expenses, which have kind of carried us to this precipice which COVID has maybe pushed us over. The World Economic Forum have called it the Great Reset. Do you think the long-standing capitalist model that has succeeded and flourished for many, many years in many countries, does that need to be rethought?
I suspect it does. I mean, I like the phrase "the Great Reset." It reminds me of whatever I have to do when I have a problem with my computer, which is to turn it off and turn it on again. And I think many of us would like to be doing that to the world in 2020. Mm-hmm. The problem with that, of course, is that unless you actually treat the underlying causes of whatever it was that caused your computer to freeze or your economy to shudder to a halt, it's going to happen again. So we need to do more than reset. We need probably to reset, and we probably need to reinvent. There will be big questions for the New World Order. Some of those questions will talk about the system. Is capitalism still the right system for the global economy? Is globalization still the right approach? Or actually, will COVID-19 make everybody a little bit more local in their approach? And certainly that's something that is being talked about at the moment. Will people try to be more self-sufficient rather than necessarily relying on just-in-time supply chains, which are hugely efficient and connect the world, but are obviously vulnerable to big shocks like the one that we've just seen. Will business motive change away from a shareholder-focused profit motive to a more multi-stakeholder, more broadly purposeful approach? What is the role of business? Many would argue that it's simply to return profit to shareholders. But of course, there's a growing movement that suggests that businesses should be about much more than that and should be more focused on a broader agenda. And I think we will be having a lot of those types of conversation.
That people power socialist approach, listening to the people that make up your entity, your nation, your state, whatever it might be, is something that the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who's won plaudits aplenty for the way that she's handled the crisis in New Zealand, was speaking at Davos in 2019 about the new economic well-being plan for New Zealand, which I think hits a lot of the points that we've discussed here. So let's take a listen.
Our mental health and well-being is not what it should be. So our plan is, through the wellbeing work that we're doing, a living standards framework, and our wellbeing budget, where if you're a minister, you want to spend money, you have to prove that you are going to improve intergenerational wellbeing. We are hoping to embed in actually what the public is asking us for to address the societal wellbeing of our nation, not just our economic wellbeing. We've been called, during the post-GFC environment, we were called a rock star economy. You know, people look to us as an example, I think, of an economy that recovered quickly. And yet, during that period, some of those statistics were exactly that, staggering, and not a measure of success, I think, that we would hold ourselves to.
We're still here with Rob Willock, the director of the Economist Corporate Network for the Middle East and North Africa region. Rob, thanks for sticking around. We got your thoughts on quite a hard-hitting, heavy topic in the state of the global economy, but we would like to get to know you a little bit better. So I'm going to throw some questions your way that do just that, if you're game for it.
I am. Let's go.
Let's do this. Okay, first question. Would you rather win the FIFA World Cup or win a gold medal at the Olympics?
Okay, I'm quite clear on this one. I would rather win the FIFA World Cup.
Okay, books or music?
Yeah, interesting one. I'm not the sort of person who needs to live my life with a soundtrack. So I'm not one of these people who's constantly got earphones on. I am a bookworm. And so I choose books, actually, in this instance. I'm always on the lookout for interesting things to read. Just recently finished an extraordinary series of books by George MacDonald Fraser, The Flashman Papers. If you've ever come across those, it's historical fiction, all set in sort of Victorian times, looking at Britain's misbehaviour during the years of empire.
What did you want to be when you were growing up?
I don't have a clear memory of this. I wasn't one of these kids that was desperate to be a fireman or a train driver. But I came across an old programme when I was last back in the UK, an old school programme from a rugby tour that I participated in. And there were little pen portraits of each of the players. And I found to my astonishment when I read my own pen portrait that I claimed that I wanted to be a lawyer when I grew up.
If you could live the life of any other person, dead or alive, who would it be? Well,
I think probably I would like to be, a Formula One driver from the age when F1 was really sexy. Probably 50s or 60s, or maybe even into the early 70s. I'm thinking a James Hunt character.
Oh, yeah.
Someone who was talented and successful, but also really got the most out of that luxury jet set lifestyle. Yeah. So I think that was the perfect combination, I think, of extraordinary lifestyle, thrills and spills, and all the benefits that went with it.
Rob, thanks so much for joining us on Comms Life. It was great to get your thoughts on the big topics and then get to know you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks for listening to Comms Life. For more episodes, you can download the Comms Life podcast from Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Keep up to date with everything from the Comms Life team by following our social media pages on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Stay safe and be well.